Hello, thank you for joining us today. This is Sam Evans with IAAP, and I'm so pleased to join us, have our Teach Access colleagues and our peers in accessibility and research join us today. I'm going to allow Kate Sanka from Teach Access to introduce herself and Teach Access, and then I'll come back and introduce IAAP and our housekeeping notes for this webinar. Kate, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sam. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. My name is Kate Sanka. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director for Teach Access. If you aren't familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit that works to support educators to learn about accessibility and disability and teach about it, and students to learn about it. We have a variety of programs. We're happy to share those later. I am joined by some of my team today. They'll be helping out with keeping track of some things in the chat and sharing resources as it makes sense. But we're really thrilled to be here. We're so grateful to be partnering with Sam and all of the IAAP team on this. I know you're in for some really great content. I've had a chance to peek at the questions. There's some good stuff here. So welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will turn it back to you, Sam.
So this is Sam Evans. I'm the certification director at IAAP, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And just before we begin today, we are going to have not only the authors for the book, the book is what every engineer should know about digital accessibility, but our program today is what everyone should know about digital accessibility. So the authors, Sarah Horton and David Sloan, are here with us, and the Teach Access team and their colleagues are here for us. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Closed captioning is provided. To enable closed captioning, you can select the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There are also stream text links for English, French, German, Spanish, and Swedish. This will be posted in the chat as well. We also have American Sign Language provided. Microphones for everyone that is attending are muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions. And we're going to ask that attendees post your questions into the Q&A so that we can follow your questions and share those to the panel and our moderator. But of course, the chat is a great opportunity for discussion for everyone, and our panelists and our other colleagues will be posting to chat with other resources as well. We will monitor chat for dialogue and technical issues. We do have a support team member that's here. This webinar will be recorded and will be available in the IAAP webinar archives and in our public IAAP YouTube channel. We will share a copy of the recording and the presentation to everyone who registered. So that's high-level information about our housekeeping for today. But I'd like to turn today's program over now to our moderator, Samantha Lynch Johnson, who will take us through the rest of our time together. Samantha, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Sam and Kate. I appreciate the welcome. Good morning or afternoon, evening to everyone. I'm Samantha Lynch Johnson, and I've been a digital accessibility practitioner for over 10 years now. I'm honored to guide this discussion about what everyone should know about accessibility. A little bit about the path that we'll be taking. We'll examine how a lack of foundational understanding limits progress in the accessible world, in the digital accessible world. We'll explore the range of concepts that make up digital accessibility foundations. We'll discuss a couple methods for covering these concepts, in formal education or in workplace learning. We'll pause for some audience questions because I'm sure that you will have questions about the material. And then we'll touch on the different roles in the development and how they can contribute to accessibility. We'll talk a little bit about emerging technologies and recommend a few resources. But first, a little bit about our panelists who will be sharing their expertise. And you can read longer bios or more about our panelists on the IAAP website. David Sloan, our first panelist, is the Chief Accessibility Officer at Vispher and User Experience Practice Manager with TPGI, Vispher's digital accessibility consultancy arm. Dave has worked in digital accessibility for 25 years and is the co-author of What Every Engineer Should Know About Digital Accessibility, published earlier this year. Fun fact about David is that his first paid job was as a cartographer on the team that published the first digital version of the Times Comprehensive Atlas of the World. My first job was babysitting. Yasmin El-Glili is an associate professor of computer science at Western Washington University and leads the Computing for Inclusion and Disability, or KIND lab. For the past 8 years, she's led several projects advancing accessibility education in computer science and machine learning, funded by the National Science Foundation and the ACM Special Interest Group on Computer Science in Education. Yasmin is one of 3 siblings, has 3 children, and has worked as a computer science professor on 3 different continents. And we'll listen for more 3s that occur for Yasmin. Sarah Luthwaite is a senior research fellow at the Center for Research and Inclusion at the University of Southampton in the UK. She is the PI for a major 5-year UK research and innovation study on teaching accessibility. Professor on W3C, Web Accessibility Education and Outreach Working Group, the Curriculum Task Force, and has over 18 years of research experience across education, HCI, accessibility, and critical disability studies. Fun fact, Sarah knows about being rickrolled. She actually grew up in the same town as pop star Rick Astley. And Mina Das. Mina is a software engineer at Microsoft, focusing on creating accessible web experiences. Drawing from her own experience with a speech disability, Mina is deeply committed to tech inclusion and ensuring that digital spaces are accessible to everyone. She founded Working with Disabilities Support Group for professionals with disabilities and boasts over 4,000 members. Mina is a board member at the nonprofit for Teach Access and aims to close the digital accessibility skills gap. She's been featured in news outlets such as Times of India, ABC News, and NASDAQ for her insight on tech and disability. The one thing to know about Mina is that she can eat one of her superpowers is that she can eat spicy food anytime, any day. She always gets the hottest salsa at any Mexican restaurant. And those are our panelists, and we hope that their skills and their knowledge will help guide your experience about what everyone should know about accessibility. I'd like to begin the panel by setting the tone for our conversation with a quote from Sean Layton Henry on Ability Day 2024. The inflection and the emphasis is mine, but Sean's words have such wisdom. The other thing I want to make a big point of is that WCAG is not an introduction to accessibility. If someone says, where do I learn about accessibility? And you point them to WCAG, it's like a deer in the headlights that's drinking from the fire hose, whatever metaphor you want to use. Don't. I said this at a conference once. Don't point to WCAG. The pause is start with the intro material. So WCAG is a technical standard. It has a purpose. It's incredibly useful. It's needed in the field, but it is not the starting place for accessibility. So let's get to the starting place. And this first question is for all of our panel, and we'll start with David. What should everyone know about digital accessibility? Where is the starting place? And why is it important within the broader context of disability inclusion? David?
It's a very good question to start with. And first of all, hi everyone attending today. It's a question that my co-author Sarah Horton and I wrestled with a lot when we were writing our book. just how to filter out all of the additional information that people tend to encounter, the more advanced information and accessibility that's still available and easy to find and can potentially intimidate and confuse people, and getting back to the core foundations that everyone should know, anyone who has any influence on digital resources. And when we put together our book, we split it into two sections. We had a foundation section and the sort of practical aspect of applying those foundations in a specific role or job context. But ultimately, the core foundations that we identified were firstly to understand about disability and its connection to digital inclusion. Ultimately why we are doing, or why accessibility is so important. And then we thought, well, it's important to understand about accessibility needs of people, which may be related to disability, and also additional situational aspects. So understanding what those accessibility needs from a people perspective. And then understanding about assistive technology, understanding about the solutions that already exist to help people with accessibility needs successfully use technology for everyday tasks. And then we kind of shift into more of the core attributes of digital accessibility, that sort of the underlying attributes that are really important to appreciate, the tools that you have at your disposal if you're working with digital resources. So supporting compatibility with different devices, including assistive technologies, other input and output devices that people might be using beyond what you assume that just because you use certain devices, that's what everyone else uses. Concepts of linearization, the fact that some people will be listening to or sensing through touch digital content in a linearized fashion, and supporting ways of interacting with that effectively. And related to that, keyboard-driven operation, is assuming, not assuming that everyone can use a touch pointer-based input device like a mouse or your finger, making sure that you're aware of keyboard driven operation. And then the flexibility and adaptability of output, the fact that digital content compared to printed content is highly flexible, and so allowing that flexibility, support, making it possible for people to adapt output to suit their own needs is another core attribute. And then finally, programmatic access to accessibility information, whatever platform or technology you're building digital content in, taking advantage of the fact that there are ways to expose accessibility information about that content to assistive technologies. So they were really the main foundations that we focused on at the start of the book that kind of could be applied across all sorts of different digital platforms.
Great, and I'll pop it over to Yasmin. What would you say is foundational for that everyone should know about digital accessibility?
So I want to say that I totally agree with David in what he said. And for a beginning, it is really difficult to select what topics to begin with. I teach an elective course on accessibility, and I've been doing this for like 7 years now. And it is usually really difficult to select, okay, these are the only topics I have to cover because I have that time frame, like to finish a course. And in addition to what David was saying, one thing I'd like to highlight in my course is the mindset of nothing about us without us, this powerful principle that engage people with disabilities in all decisions that are made, policies, laws, and that apply very explicitly also in the development of software. And because I usually start with this, you can't just imagine that people with disabilities need this software. We have to work with people with disabilities and understand the requirements in the design, and all the other phases of the software development lifecycle. This for me goes hand in hand with also the ethics of human subject research, because as my students are going to interact with people with disabilities and users in general, they really need to learn about the principles of justice, beneficence, and what was that third principle? Respect, right? Like, so these are the three main principles that everybody who's going to work with users and users with disabilities included, right? Like, they need to learn about this. There are resources available at universities for students to learn about these protocols and apply them. In CS also, like as David was saying, we usually tend to talk a lot about input-output devices, and these are the default examples are a screen and a mouse and a keyboard. So one thing I also like to remind my students about is, well, these are not all the devices, like there are more devices, something like refreshable braille display, and some people can use only keyboard. Maybe the keyboard is really difficult to use. So these are like my starting points, like to enter the world of accessibility.
That's a lovely segue. Nina, how would you say, especially pivoting from what Yasmin shared, what would you say is the importance of digital accessibility foundations?
Sure. So I think I wanted to start with saying that I think a lot of people, they confuse the concept of digital accessibility with just assistive technology. I think it's important to know the difference. I still remember I was trying to talk to a friend, and she was like, people with disabilities, they just need assistive tech to do their job better. But if a site or an application, it is not designed with accessibility, there is no use of an assistive technology device. So the application that has to be designed with accessibility considerations. So I think that is so important. You can have the best assistive technology, but it's not going to work if the site is not accessible. So I think that's a very important point to consider, why accessibility is so important. I look forward to sharing more and the more questions, but yeah, I just wanted to bring that point.
And we'll pivot a little to Sarah, whose area is research. Talk a little bit, and pulling from what Nina was saying and what Yasmin was saying, and talk a bit about accessibility and what your research shows and in accessibility foundations.
So just to say, first off, I completely agree with the other panelists. So I think we've covered a lot of ground really very nicely. So the research I've been doing has been talking to experienced educators in the workplace, in academia, and starting points are really fundamental and cause a lot of issues. And one of the questions for educators is, where are people starting from? So I know people watching this video, people joining today are going to be coming from a lot of different places, different levels, and that level setting is something that educators spend a lot of time and attention on to get a foundational principles in place, which we'll talk about a little more, I know, as we go through these questions. I think that David's absolutely right that complexity can be an issue, because accessibility can pull us in a lot of different directions, like legal, moral, ethical. There's the assistive technology piece. There are the techniques we need to learn to make accessible systems. There are standards and so forth. But everybody's starting from somewhere. So how we get people invested in understanding what this is about frequently comes from an awareness of disability and an awareness of the fundamental digital rights that we all have and the importance of these. So recognizing that when we're designing for disability, we're designing for everybody. And that in a sense, sometimes the starting place is about unlearning, that sometimes people come to accessibility thinking they know what normal looks like without actually recognizing the diversity that's within all of us and our wider communities and our professional communities. So the first step is frequently about raising that awareness of ourselves, of who we are, and getting that conceptual understanding of disability as a normal part of everyday life. And then with that, we see that this is a professional activity of designing for everybody, and it's an act of professionalism, which I think can be really important.
And the next question, I'm targeting to Yasmin and Nina. Sarah's mentioning that we all have an impact somewhat on designing for accessibility, whether it's our consumption or it's our active production of materials or engagement with it. So how can the foundational knowledge of accessibility, digital accessibility, be established among those who impact it, among those players who are impacted? And it's a two-parter, so you can take either part. What methods do you think we can use in education, formal education, in workplace learning? What kind of methods do you think we can use to help drive that along?
I can go first. So, as we were saying, like there are a lot of materials that can be covered when we teach accessibility, and it can be overwhelming to teach everything in just one course. And at the same time, like if like you do something like I do, like teach an elective course, it's not seen by everyone, right? Like just a few number of students will be able to register for this course. And for the rest of the students, they don't get the chance to learn about accessibility. So a good way to start would be probably to think about all the different aspects of accessibility we would like to teach, like defining maybe a set of learning objectives, and then try to distribute them among the different courses that are required for computer science or software engineering students, to make sure that all the important aspects are covered and are seen by all students. And just like as we do with other learning objectives in our courses, something like maybe version control, we introduce it in like introductory courses, just a simple concept. And then as we progress in our CS program, we keep on adding more details to the same concept. So adding more depth and reinforcing the concepts as we go. And by the time students graduate, in many programs, they have a senior project or a big project like they do before graduation. It will be really fantastic, like if we have accessibility as one of the metrics to evaluate this like conclusion project, like after students go through like their whole program over like 4 or 5 years, and then they can apply everything to one big project. It doesn't have to be an assistive technology, right? Just like any project. And as as sort of saying, when we design for everyone, right? And we want to be professional. So let's see if like the end product that our students produce conform to the accessibility principles and accessibility guidelines. Did I answer your question? Okay.
I can I can go next, and then I can speak about the workplace a bit. So a lot of the workplaces out there, they have this standard onboarding course, which like goes over accessibility principles, accessibility foundations, which is great to start with. But what after that? People, they're not going to remember these things if they just take one course. So I'm gonna try to give an example of a software engineer. So we write code every day. One of the things which I use in my day-to-day job is like something called a code linter. So while I am coding, it will show me the accessibility errors in my code as I type. That's a great way to learn because it is showing me the problems real time, and it's so showing me how to fix them. So that's great. Another thing what we try to do in the code review comments is to make sure all my coworkers, they are trying to write accessible code too. So in that way, we have that culture built in to make sure we are shipping accessible code. Another thing, what I have seen across companies is this accessibility champions model where every team, they have a select accessibility champion who will make sure their products, whatever they are developing, that is being done with accessibility in mind. I think we often talk about in the education sector that they have this accessibility course where they just teach one course and like that's it. But it's just like not the right way sometimes. It like has to be integrated across the whole course as a whole. I feel the industry has the same problem too. We are trying to teach the employees, but we are not trying to make sure they carry those skills towards their work. So I think we have a gap in that. So yeah.
Hi, everybody. This is Kate, Kate Sonka from Teach Access. We know that our wonderful moderator is having a bit of some issues with audio. So as she's working to get connected, still can't hear you, Samantha, sorry. I will jump in here and pose the next question to our panelists. So appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. And of course, the very last point that you were making, Nina, I think is super important. This idea of things not necessarily being integrated across the curriculum in terms of students being able to get this foundational knowledge in accessibility and disability. And so to that end, the next question we have here is, what are the implications of a lack of foundational understanding of disability and digital accessibility? And how does it limit progress in creating an accessible digital world? And I think for this, we'd love to hear maybe Mina from you again, and Sarah Luthwaite. So whoever would like to take that question first would be great.
Mina, would you like to take this one from a sort of practice professional perspective, and then I'll add?
Sure. So I think I think the lack of the foundational skills it can cause so many problems. So I think the first problem is that you are going to take more time to ship your product. So that is for sure, because every company, they will have to follow some guidelines before you ship your product. And if it's not meeting certain standards, you're going to have to go through the loop to fix that. Like, the whole process will take time than if you just fixed it from the start. So yeah, but like that's the legal sort of reason. The think one of the most important reasons is that accessibility is a fundamental right. I remember when we had COVID, pandemic still going on, very strong. The Department of Justice, they had to reach so many settlements with pharmacies, with hospitals, because their sites were not accessible. So say people who use screen readers, they could not schedule time to book their vaccines, get important information. So accessibility is just more than compliance. Not having the foundational skills can does lead to very not usable experiences for people with disabilities. Yeah, so it's, I think, of the fundamental human right, and everybody should know about these skills.
And we'll turn to Sarah. Sarah, can you add about research? In your research, what are the implications of the lack of foundational understanding that you've seen, especially as you study critical disability studies? Can you add some perspective on that?
Certainly. So in terms of our team's research, talking with expert panels and doing empirical research with educators, and we've published on this. Accessibility is a shared endeavour, which we know it cascades across different roles. So just as Mina said, it's going to affect your timeline to shipping if people aren't on the same page in terms of being able to address what the expectations are, what the work looks like collectively from the outset. And whilst we know accessibility will look different depending on specialisms and expertise at maybe a technical level, there is a need to have that communal knowledge, agreed definitions and priorities across a team. So we see a lot of educators do this this foundational accessibility 101, and that will be in a mixed group. So not necessarily say just with the software engineers, just with the web designers, because people have to understand what the workflow is across different roles so they can have expectations, so they can communicate about accessibility. And it's something when we worked on the W3C curricula, we're trying to weave in this communication dimension, which is often called a soft skill, but I would like to think of it as a professional skill. How we communicate about accessibility fundamentally affects how effective a team can be, an organization could be. And I know Mina's already mentioned that organizational culture and the need for learning that's peer learning, as well as maybe more traditional courses, the need for champions. So to establish that culture, you have to start from the same page. So this foundational knowledge, which I know Sarah Horton and Dave address in their book, it's so fundamental prior to then allowing people to diversify and get to those specialist places they need to get to that are maybe more role specific. Thank you.
And I'm going to turn to David. Can you talk through some approaches to support teaching and learning different foundational concepts? So Sarah just referred to you covering that in the book with Sarah Horton. And can you give us a little tease as to what are some of those concepts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a few different approaches that can be taken, and I think one really effective way to get people thinking broadly about how to implement solutions without being constrained by very specific and detailed technical requirements that may take a lot of understanding to apply appropriately is to talk about high-level principles, guiding principles for universal design. So for example, the 7 principles of universal design from North Carolina State University, and these are like nearly 30 years old, and they still have really effective application to digital resources, even though they were mainly targeted for the physical world. We talked at the start of the session about the limitations of diving too deeply into the web content accessibility guidelines. But then the guidelines themselves, the 13 guidelines of WCAG, are incredibly helpful in providing people with flexibility and direction in what to build. So integrating those kind of high-level guidelines and talking about how they might be applied in a particular design or development project can help avoid learners going too deeply into the details too quickly. I think in terms of supporting teaching and learning of different foundational concepts, looking at ways to integrate accessibility across every other learning opportunity that influences digital skills development is a really important goal. So rather than relying on an accessibility course to teach all the accessibility information, that's maybe helpful, but also looking for ways to integrate accessibility knowledge into other learning opportunities helps make sure that accessibility is part of good professional practice, as Sarah said, that knowledge is part of practice rather than stands alone as a separate specialism, which then can become, oh, I don't need to do that. Somebody else can take care of that. And the other thing I think is really critical to communicating the foundational principles is work in creating as many possible ways for learners to directly learn about the lived experience of people with disabilities. Reading about lived experiences, watching media, movies like Crip Camp, just to get an understanding of the ways in which people with diverse disabilities live their lives, use technology, solve problems, get by things that somebody who without that insight might not be aware that's a problem that can be overcome. But here's another problem that you as a digital designer could quickly fix with a little bit of insight. And the last thing I would say is in any educational situation that talks about digital accessibility, speak to learners on assumption that some of those learners will be disabled themselves. I think one of the challenges that historically has existed in accessibility teaching and learning is to effectively other people with disabilities by not thinking that they're in the room when you as an educator are talking about accessibility. People with disabilities need to learn about accessibility just as everyone else does. So making sure that is intrinsic to every piece of learning and learning resource, every teaching activity. Those of you who are disabled, rather than assuming that people with disabilities who benefit from accessibility are not in that room of learners.
Yeah. Thank you. And we've shared quite a bit of material and covered quite a bit of ground already. And I'll actually turn to both Kate and Sam, who are monitoring our Q&A. And we can take one question from our Q&A. Sam?
Yep. So we've got a lot of really good questions and comments in the Q&A, but I'm going to select one from Heidi. Their question says, if you are a small team working on a movement toward better accessibility practices in your organization, what are some of the best trainings and recommendations to provide that training without overwhelming them, meaning your teammates? Follow-up, any recommendations on how to vet vendors that say they are accessible when they're not? Are there good questions to ask, certifications to look for, etc.?
We're going to turn that sounds almost like an industry question, but it also absolutely goes to what David is covering. So I'll start with Mina and then pop over to David, if you don't mind. And we'll take a shortened response because we want to make sure we get a lot of our good content in. Thank you.
Yeah, I try to keep this short. So, as they said in my bio before, I'm this board of a nonprofit called Teach Access. They have really good resources to just get started in the field of accessibility, very basic trainings, trying to teach you the basic skills for somebody who is new. I think those trainings can be really useful for smaller companies might not have the bandwidth to produce their own courses. So yeah, definitely have a look at that. Yeah, I turn this over to David if you have any thoughts.
I think as a general principle, helping focus on avoiding people becoming overwhelmed, especially with small teams, is really trying to make sure that accessibility knowledge is shared in bite-sized portions rather than too much. Help give people maybe one thing to work on, like making sure that color contrast requirements are addressed, or making sure that an application can be operated using the keyboard. Focus on that one thing and help people be successful in embedding that requirement into what they do. And when people feel successful by focusing on one thing, then that, on the one hand, it gives them confidence to move on to integrate other accessibility requirements into their work. But it also, make sure that they have a solid foundation to build on, and that work is kind of ingrained. That's what people do as a matter of course, rather than we forget about that and then move on to something else. It becomes almost a natural instinct to build that keyboard functionality, and so you get two for the price of one, effectively, when you focus on one little thing. So whatever that may be, looking for role-based guidance, and we can follow up offline with resources that help provide bite-sized information that is relevant to specific roles, and then you sort of gradually build that up over time. And I think that's a great way of helping learners be successful and maintain that success over time.
And I will actually pull Yasmin into this part of the conversation. In higher ed, very often, as a computer science professor, you're teaching your students, but how do we get that to spread among the entirety of the higher ed, where students are producing inaccessible materials, or professors are producing also inaccessible content? How do we get that to spread in higher ed or in a different field?
It's a good question. I was just about to write a note in the chat, to add to the great points Mina and Dave talked about for making progress. I thought, if it's at all feasible, you may want to try to connect with local community of people with disabilities that could maybe help with testing your product. And, it just, another thought, to help with making progress towards accessible product. In higher ed, conversations are ongoing, and one thing in computer science is that it always evolves. And in higher ed, especially computer science, professors would love to see their students very proficient and hired, right? So highlighting the need in industry that accessibility is really needed. It's a desired skill. And I know Teach Access also just recreated the gap survey, showing that there is a need, and many students still graduated without accessibility skills. That can play a big role in motivating students to learn, professors to teach about accessibility. So I think this ongoing conversation between academia and industry in advocacy group is really critical for the awareness and spread awareness about accessibility. And I think also a program Study Away that Teach Access developed few years ago, several years ago now, is also helpful, because students create demand themselves. They will come back to their school and they will tell their professors and their colleagues about what they learned. And when people start to realize that, well, there is all these materials that are really important and we don't cover, then they will start to take steps, to similar to industry, making progress, right? We want to make progress, and and hopefully with this conversation, we get more people interested in and empowered to learn and teach about accessibility.
And I will actually turn to Sarah. Sarah, one area that frequently gets short shrift in our conversation is accessibility in research, right? Reams of research are produced annually, and we keep saying nothing about us without us, yet where is the accessibility, digital accessibility, and the access for people with disabilities for research? And I know this isn't necessarily only your you're not speaking for the entirety of all research, but I'd love to hear your perspective on how can we bring that along with us.
So I will add quickly to the previous question if I could, which is I think colleagues have raised some really good approaches, some about building your technical knowledge, some about building awareness. Between the two, there's kind of this procedural knowledge space about prioritizing, about making good decisions, about the management of accessibility. For small teams looking to develop that, there are activities like the Accessibility Internet Rally, and there are communities where you might want to look for mentors who might be able to model some of that and give you those useful conversations to move that kind of process space forward. So I wanted to highlight that. I think in the research space, we've lagged because of, I think, what David identified about a focus, if you like, on the users of research, or as we might focus on accessibility for students, we don't focus on accessibility for staff in higher education. And the good news is I think that increasingly publishers, funders, the big research organisations, certainly in the UK, are taking accessibility a lot more seriously, and we're seeing a lot of hiring right now from some of the big research funders. I won't dive deeply into that now because I'm sure we've got exciting questions, but it speaks to this point about recognizing accessibility isn't something over there. It's for ourselves, it's for our colleagues, our junior staff, our new hires, our bosses. It's for all of us.
Absolutely. And I will actually skip ahead to a couple questions. If I want to cover a little bit about emerging technologies such as AI and machine learning and mobile accessibility, what potential benefits and challenges should we be aware of, especially as we are implementing and thinking about what we should learn about accessibility, given all these? And I will start with David on this question.
It's a great question, because at the end of our book, we gave about 1 page to the future of accessibility and said that innovations often exacerbate exclusion of people with disabilities rather than reduce exclusion, because people are so quick to implement something new and cool without really thinking about its implications on historically marginalized and neglected members of society. So I think that focusing on the fundamentals of accessibility allows us to understand how emerging technologies like AI can best be used as tools to help us do our jobs better. Without that fundamental understanding of accessibility, then the worry is that innovation just exacerbates issues. But I want to be positive and say, if we understand how it can be used as a tool, then we can use it effectively.
Great. Can we pop over to Yasmin and then final words from Nina and Sarah to bring it home?
So the same question, yeah.
Yes, please.
So I'm kind of optimistic. I feel with new technology, AI and machine learning, there could be more opportunities to solve some of the accessibility barriers that we see around. I could see this happening. I would just worry a little bit probably about the inclusion of people with disabilities in the data collection procedures, and I would hope to see some guidelines regarding protection of their privacy and how this data will be protected. But overall, I'm optimistic. I think there is a big room for improving current services using AI.
Nina?
Yeah, I think the same principle has to be applied to emerging technologies such as VR, AR, mixed reality. There has been, I think, a lot of work being done to see how AR, VR, they can help people with disabilities do better. but at the same time, we have to make sure they are designed with accessibility in mind. If we are trying to solve one problem, we should not lose focus of the problem. So make sure they are accessible themselves. Yeah.
And final thoughts, Sarah, to bring it home.
So I'm skeptical because I think it's quite a normative technology built on statistics, and norms are problematic if they marginalize certain groups. However, one of the things I want to raise for people going forward, our developers watching, our software developers, and everybody in the workplace and students, is about search, because I wonder to what extent the use of ChatGPT and how AI will influence search may stop us from communicating with each other about accessibility and how we share our communal knowledge and grow that knowledge. So that's one of my concerns. How do we maintain our communities and the sort of accessibility commons and not lose that into machines? Because so much of what we know and what we build in terms of our knowledge in this space is about community and people coming together to build skills and to develop understanding.
Thank you. Well, and we have words to end on. I want to thank our panelists for attending today. We have David Sloan, Yasmin El Ghali, Sarah Luthwaite, and Meenakshi Das. And today we covered, our panelists brought awareness to the core concepts of disability, disability inclusion, user accessibility needs, how assistive technology impacts us, and the core attributes of accessibility. We talked a little about the guiding principles and standards and of implementing accessibility practices in our own spheres. I want to thank our panelists greatly for sharing their knowledge with us, and to thank IAAP and Teach Access for sponsoring this webinar. I will turn it back over to Samantha Evans, and I hope today that you've learned something and it has spurred you on to make accessibility part of your foundational practice. Samantha?
Yep. Thanks, everyone. This is Sam Evans with IAAP again. I'm going to hold up a copy of the book. See if I can get this to work properly. Oops, I have to turn off my video feed, the blur. The book is that Sarah and David wrote that spurred this conversation was What Every Engineer Should Know About Digital Accessibility. You don't need to be an engineer to take advantage of this for yourself, for your team, for educating your colleagues. And Malcolm is going to share a code in the chat, which will allow you to take advantage of a discount that was made available by the publishers. Thanks to David and Sarah for providing that. Again, my colleagues at Teach Access have been so amazing. Thank you, Kate, and everyone on the team, Rolando, Leslie, and all of the participants on our panel today for contributing and gathering us together. I am with IAAP, and so if you're not an IAAP member, we welcome you. If you're interested to learn about IAAP, we have a little over 6,500 accessibility professionals in more than 100 countries around the world. All of our webinars, members receive complimentary access to our live professional education and our archive. This webinar will be on our subject matter expert playlist on YouTube, along with others, so you'll have access to that when we follow up with our links. Thank you so much. We look forward to working with you as colleagues and peers in advancing accessibility and removing barriers for people with disabilities around the world so that everyone can live, learn, work, and play in their community of choice. Thank you again, everyone.